Good morning, and today we're going to talk about Southern Gothic literature of the United States. So what comes to mind when you hear the word Goth? Well, the terms Goth and Gothic were originally used to describe the Germanic tribes that pilfered and plundered across Europe from the 3rd to the 5th centuries. Now, the architecture in Europe from the 12th to the 16th centuries is usually called Gothic architecture. It is characterized by pointed arches and flying buttresses. And here we have several examples across Europe. Now, in 18th century England, the term Gothic became synonymous with the Middle Ages, which was a period of chaos and superstition. So one of the first Gothic literary novels that we get from Europe is a novel called The Castle of Otranto. It's a novel by Horace Walpole, written in 1764. It's likely the first example of Gothic literature that we have. So then what is the characteristic of Gothic literature? You usually see this gloom and doom kind of setting. You have mysterious castles, there might be dungeons, there might be frightening forests around, there's labyrinths and mazes all around, secret passages to and from places. You might be spending time walking through cemeteries. There's a lot of mist and fog and rain. The heroes and villains are quite ambiguous. You don't really have a hero and you don't really have a villain. Nobody's either absolutely good or absolutely evil. And a lot of times Gothic literature often involves an ancestral curse and family secrets. So the common motifs that we see in Gothic literature, you might see this sense of revenge. Somebody is not happy with someone else in the family, or somebody has taken something away and you need to enact revenge. There's also this sense of decay, whether it is decay of the architecture and the homelands, whether it's decay of the family or even a family member themselves. You might see transformations or superstitions coming on as well. Grave robbing, where you're actually going into the cemetery and looking for something specific. There's always an element of mystery. We're not quite sure what's going to happen next. Your characters might talk about their nightmares or their dreams, or they might feel like they're living through a nightmare or a dream. There might be the sense of necromancy. There might be a pursued female figure, somebody who might be either a mystical, mysterious type of a female figure, or a female figure is being pursued by something dark and mysterious. And almost always you have an unreliable narrator. This person has to create an element of mystery, maybe an element of fear, so they're not going to tell you everything you need to know. Now, some of the famous Gothic literature that we have from Europe is going to be Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and Dracula by Bram Stoker, both from England, both from the 19th century. So whereas traditional Gothic literature most often took the novel form, when it comes to America, American writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote primarily short stories. Now, Southern Gothic literature turns the tropes of traditional Gothic literature, such as having a hero and a monster, into typical American Southerners. It also focuses on the South's moral and social shortcomings of damaged and even delusional characters, usually in a small town. So what are the characteristics specifically of American Southern Gothic literature? First is the sense of the grotesque. Now, this term can include situations and places, as well as deeply flawed, disturbing characters who often exhibit antisocial behavior while simultaneously invoking feelings of sympathetic pity. You don't like the character, and at the same time, you feel a sense of pity towards them. Other characteristics of Southern Gothic literature include this strong sense of place, a disturbing, realistic, or even ironic event, some sense of nostalgia for the past, perhaps some broken or some unusual physical object that takes symbolism, how an outsider might become a hero. There might even be senses of the new supernatural and a generational decay, and there, of course, might even be a bit of dark humor. So when we take a look at Edgar Allan Poe, born in 1809 and died in 1849, he's originally from Maryland, but he spent quite a bit of time in Virginia and the South. And he's considered the father of the modern detective story and the architect of the modern short story in the United States. Now, we consider Southern Gothic literature to start here with Poe. He changed the Gothic genre by focusing on the psychology of the characters rather than the supernatural events. And some of Poe's most famous short works would be The Black Cat, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, and he also has Gothic poems such as The Raven and Annabel Lee. Now, some facts about Poe. When he's orphaned by age 3, he grows up in Richmond, Virginia with foster parents. That's where he gets his secondary name, Allen. And in 1825, he entered the University of Virginia, but he left later due to gambling debts and just simply a lack of money. So then in 1827, he enlisted in the U.S. Army under the name of Edgar A. Perry. And he attended West Point, but he was court-martialed and kicked out in 1831, and by this point, the Allens family that had raised him has just decided to let him go. So he goes back looking for his original family, and he does find an older aunt and a cousin by the name of Virginia Clem, who's 14, and decides almost immediately to marry her. Now, the other interesting psychology about Poe and his short stories is that he's always been kind of interested in the ideals of death. And there are theories on the cause of Poe's actual death that almost seems like a Gothic literary piece in and of itself. So a lot of people think, well, he may have died of his alcoholism, he may have died of a mugging, lesions on the brain, tuberculosis, epilepsy. He might have had an illness, he might have, brought the illness on himself. But most likely, he might have died of cooping. Now, it was an election time, and during the elections, gangs would kidnap innocent people and hold them in a room called a coop. And these victims were forced to visit polls, voting again and again. The gangs plied the victims with liquor and beat them to ensure cooperation. And when we find Poe eventually in the street, he looks like he's been beat up, and he looks like he's been absolutely drugged with so much alcohol. Now, Poe's body was originally placed in an unmarked grave, but on November 17, 1875, his body was moved and a monument was finally dedicated. 3 people are buried underneath it: Poe, his wife Virginia, and his aunt. Now, on 1949 and continuing until about 2009, on the night of the anniversary of Poe's death, a mysterious stranger would leave a partial bottle of cognac and 3 roses on Poe's grave every single year. And for some reason it stops in 2009. We can only imagine perhaps the person who was doing it every year finally passed on, but it was 60 years of wondering, who is this mysterious stranger? Our next Southern Gothic literary author is going to be William Faulkner. Now, William Faulkner didn't graduate from high school or college, but he lived in a small town in the poorest state of the nation during the Great Depression, the state of Mississippi. He faced financial ruin and still managed to write multiple novels set in the imaginary world of Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi. And this results in his becoming one of the most acclaimed writers of the 20th century. So when we take a look at the timeline of William Faulkner's life, he was born on September 25, 1897 in New Albany, Mississippi. And in 1918, he joined the British Royal Flying Corps to attempt to get into World War I, but he was a little late. So coming back to Mississippi, in 1924, he published a book of poetry, The Marble Faun. And he publishes his first novel the next year, Soldier's Pay. By this point in time, he's getting at least enough money to start a family, so in 1930, he marries Estelle Oldham. Shortly after that, their daughter Jill is born in 1933, but in between the marriage and his first child, he writes some of his most famous works, such as The Sound and the Fury, Sanctuary, As I Lay Dying, and Light in August. Now, these works would eventually become screenplays from 1932 to 1945, and in 1936 he writes Absalom, Absalom. Now, by the time he finishes with his screenplays and continues back into work for shorter stories, he wins the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949, and shortly after, in 1962, William Faulkner dies. Some interesting facts about William Faulkner. He supported himself as a postmaster at the University of Mississippi, where his dad had a job, but he was fired for reading on the job. He was a notorious ladies' man. Even though he was married, he was known to have a few flings on the side. He declined a dinner invitation to the White House, saying it was a long way to go just to eat. He wasn't exactly known to be the most friendly of people. And he also wrote a short story collection of crime fiction called A Knight's Gambit. And this is the William Faulkner House in Oxford, Mississippi. Now, Faulkner's writing, filled with the sights, sounds, and smells of the South, and populated with vivid, unforgettable characters, examines the distinctive frame of mind of the people in that place and time. Yet his Gothic characters are universal in their struggle with what he called in his Nobel Prize speech, the old verities and truths of the heart, love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. And our next Gothic author we will look at is Flannery O'Connor. She was considered one of America's greatest writers of the 20th century, even though she produced only 2 short novels, 2 collections of short stories, and a number of essays and letters. A devout Catholic and an unabashedly ardent believer, she wrote of marginalized people in unknown rural areas who encountered God's grace in the face of grotesque events, such as murder, bigotry, and sheer madness. She called it the action of grace in territory held by the devil. And some facts about your author, Flannery O'Connor. She was born on March 25th, 1925 in Savannah, Georgia. And she graduated in 1945 from Georgia State College for Women and in 1947 from the University of Iowa. Her first novel was written in 1952 and called Wise Blood, and her personal symbol was a peacock. She thought it was her symbol because it was funny looking and awkward to her, and yet it transfigured when it opened its tail. She also believed racism was a curse of the South and a failure by white Christians, and you can see that in a lot of her essays. Flannery O'Connor dies of lupus on August 3rd, 1964. Now, I highly suggest you go find some Gothic literature. Thank you so much for stopping by to learn about some of our Gothic literature and especially some of our Southern Gothic literary authors. If you'd like to learn more about William Faulkner or Flannery O'Connor or Edgar Allan Poe's writings, please leave a comment down below as to which stories you'd like me to cover. And as always, I appreciate it if you subscribed.